Alex here with a legal nuts and bolts video on sovereign immunity. This is a video that could get very technical if I let it go out of control, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to explain sovereign immunity is a thing, a little bit as to how it works, some of the ideas behind it, but I'm not going to get into some like philosophical academic discussion with the audience on it. I just want to explain what it's based on and why, and then let people look into it as they need to if they're representing themselves in certain cases out there where sovereign immunity is a thing. So first of all, I only know that sovereign immunity applies for sure in the context of suing a government, like a state, like for example the state of California, the state of New York, and also the federal government, so like, you know, the United States of America. Most likely other countries out there have similar principles, especially if they come from English common law, and even if they don't, they can exercise their sovereignty just as well without any kind of definition or anything like that, just because of what sovereignty really is, which I'll go into in a sec. I decided to do this video because a bunch of people asked me about sovereign citizens, and I'm not going to cover that in this video, but I will use this video as a springboard later on to cover sovereign citizens, so just keep that as an aside. This is going to sound really unfair, so please remember this is not my opinion. It's not something that I'm saying because I think it's the greatest thing ever or that I agree with it. It's just the way it works. And in fact, if you really struggle with fairness in the context of law, you should definitely go and watch the video Fairness versus the Law before you continue this video, because you're going to have a better grasp as to why it is that way if you see that video first. So all that being said, I'm going to find the perfect balance between really technical, formal, and too simplistic. So there are entities, all kinds of entities, business entities like corporations, trusts, LLCs. There's also ordinary people. And then there is nation states. And the big difference between all of those is that a nation state has at its command naval and air forces, a military, some of them out there have nuclear weapons, and they can say that we are not going to follow whatever kind of order or judgment or decree you're entering, because we don't have to, because we have weapons and we will fight like violently to protect whatever it is you're trying to take from me. I've talked about this in other videos, especially fairness versus the law. Law is force. Law is there to force some kind of something upon some other person or some other entity, based on hopefully some kind of code of laws, but not always. If you go back far enough, there were certain, you know, types of government where there weren't that many laws, and they just kind of winged it and did what they want, and the king or the emperor did whatever he felt like doing. And anyway, the same stuff applies going all the way back. It's just nowadays it's mainly like democratic bodies, versus just like a guy who's an emperor or a guy who's a king or whatever. So that's where sovereignty comes from. Sovereignty is something that somebody can declare. They can pronounce it. They can proclaim it to the world. I am a sovereign power. But more so than that, it's recognized. Other sovereign powers recognize the sovereignty of whoever it is that's trying to assert that they're sovereign. And the reason they do is because you have this territory, this area on the planet that's yours, and you protect it with weapons. And if some kind of judgment was entered in a court against that sovereign power, that sovereign power could say, I'm not going to follow that, and if you come and try and enforce it, I'm going to kill you with weapons. And it doesn't sound fair, but that's what it is. Now, most modern governments, especially democracies, waive sovereign immunity, and I'm not sure why this is, and I'm going to try to avoid getting philosophical, but I have an idea that it's probably because it's fair. There's some sense of fairness there. Sometimes the government does something it should not have done, and people that have been harmed need to be compensated for it. And all 50 states of the United States have waived their sovereign immunity, and so has the federal government of the United States. The tricky thing here is that it's waived It's not waived carte blanche. It's not like you can do anything you want to the government. They have passed specific statutes that specifically say where their sovereign immunity is waived. And in those areas that it's waived, a person is allowed to sue. There really isn't any limitations on how sovereign immunity can be waived. There isn't anything that stops a sovereign power from saying, change my mind, I'm exerting sovereign immunity now, close this case out, you're not getting a cent. There's nothing to stop a sovereign power from saying, you can sue us under these things, but you can't sue us under those things. There's nothing to stop a sovereign power from saying, we'll allow our own citizens to sue, but we won't allow foreigners to sue. There's nothing really there as some kind of omnipotent force that comes from the heavens or something that requires governments to be fair. Ultimately, law is force, and the government creates the law, which is there to force all the citizens to abide by it and all of that. And sovereign immunity is basically that at its root. So if you're thinking about suing a state or the federal government, you need to look in and see if you even can, and you need to look at sovereign immunity to see if it's been waived in that particular area that you want to sue on. Because if it's not waived, then whatever sovereign power you're trying to sue is immune, at least in the United States. Now, it really isn't just an internal mechanism. I've already described examples as to how it's external also. For example, the government of Saudi Arabia could create laws allowing you to sue other governments in their country, and you could be a citizen in Saudi Arabia and you could say, hey, based on the laws of my country, I can sue you. I'm going to sue you in the Saudi Arabian court. And what I mean by you is the government, maybe the United States, and get some kind of judgment in that court. Well, who knows? I mean, what's in that judgment? You know, you have to pay a Saudi citizen $20 million, or you have to give us the territory of Florida. Any kind of country can make any kind of declaration in any kind of court that they've invented out of thin air. The only thing there, the only basic principle there that really is going to prevent that from happening is sovereign immunity. And that's really just the U.S. saying, we don't acknowledge your court, we are not subjecting ourselves to your jurisdiction, and if you try and enforce that and take the territory of Florida, we're going to stop you using naval and air forces, missiles, bombs, and nukes. It's a really extreme example, but that's what sovereign immunity is. It's a power that has weapons and force behind it that allows that power to say, we're only going to comply with the orders that we will allow, because they're just that strong. That's what it is. I've tried so many other ways to explain it that don't sound so bad, but for anyone wondering what sovereign immunity is, that's what it is. And there could be all kinds of social reasons as to why democracies, especially the United States of America, have waived so much of their sovereign immunity. It does make people, you know, think, hey, if something has happened to me that's unfair, I can at least go to court and make the government pay for what they've done. And it's sort of a valve. If a government these days was to go, we have sovereign immunity, you can't sue us for anything we do, they get away with it for a while. But it's something where maybe after a few decades, either through incompetence or negligence towards citizens or other egregious conduct, it could sort of cause a buildup in pressure that could trigger riots or revolution at worst, armed civil war. And in a way, it's like a valve to release all that. It's the government saying, hey, we could just refuse to give you anything because we are the government and you can't do anything about it. We have created these courts. They're ours. We own them. They could do that, but they don't. The U.S. has a constitution and a whole bunch of judges in 50 states and all that. And so it allows people who feel like they have some kind of beef with the government to go and sue the government. And if they win, collect the money that they're entitled to, or whatever other relief it is that they're looking for. I hope this video makes sense to people. Even you have to just get past the idea of fairness, because if you get stuck on that, you won't really understand law. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's really hard for at least me and other Americans, is because we have the Constitution and other principles that sort of twist the legislature's arm into doing the right thing. Like we have due process and trial by jury and guilty until, innocent until proven guilty. And we have all these principles that are rooted in fairness. And so we get used to the system being fair, or at least it's supposed to be fair. And so when we hear this stuff like, it's not really designed that way. It is now, these days, modern times, but like you really have to go into the video fairness versus the law to really get your head around it, because I try to explain it in a way that makes sense. Even if we don't agree with it, that's what it is. So if anyone is wondering why international law is so wonky and so crazy, that's why, because international law is for the most part voluntary. Each of these nations has armies, planes, ships, tanks, weapons, and there's very little to stop a nation from saying, we're not going to comply with international law, and if you don't like it, come fight us, declare war. A long time ago, there probably were times when countries felt entitled to another country's whatever because of some kind of logical basis, something based on fairness, and the country refused, and maybe there was some kind of, oh, well, we are entitled to it, and so they declared war and they seized it. Maybe that's something that happened all the time back in the days. I'm not going to do the research on it. All I know is that if so, it doesn't really make things a whole lot better, because all it really means is that the really, really big, strong, powerful countries are the ones that can really subject other countries to their will, including international law and all that. And the really, really strong countries that have like a dozen aircraft carriers and all kinds of weapons and troops and soldiers, they could comply because they want to, put on a good, face and make a good example for the world. But ultimately, if things came down to it and it was something that the country could just not afford to give up, what's to stop them from saying, change their mind? Nope, not fair, too bad. Come and take it. That's what sovereignty is, and hopefully it helps me explain where I think the sovereign citizen movement goes wrong in another video probably come up like in a month or two from now. But at this point, I think I'm going to end this video. If anyone has any questions with regards to sovereign... Oh, one last thing I want to mention. I think I mentioned it earlier, but I'm not sure. Sovereign immunity, I know for sure applies to like all 50 states and also the federal government, but it may apply to other things that I don't know about. I really haven't done a whole lot of research on this. It's not something that I went into myself. And it's also something that's probably going to have quirks and oddities in all of the various 50 different states as to how they may have applied it, and there may be exceptions in some states and not in others. And so you may have to look into all of those situations by doing research and, looking into statutes, rules, and case law. There's for sure going to be statutes on it, because that's really, from what I have seen, where they declare where they're waiving sovereign immunity. They pass statutes. And then when it comes to case law, that's where they interpret exactly how far sovereign immunity goes. So again, if you have any questions, post in the comments below. I don't have personal experience with it, but I did want people to know it was a thing and that it comes from somewhere. It's not just an invention out of thin air. It's very common sense what sovereign immunity is. It's just not very fair, because for the most part, it's might makes right. That's what it is. And so for anyone who has any questions, again, just post them in the comments below and I'll get back to you, or send me an email, and I'll see you guys next time.